Welcome to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid. A set of conversations about our government, our politics, and the kind of country we aspire to be. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath, on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Edwin Eisendrath Show. I am obviously not Edwin Eisendrath. My name is Brian Endless, but it's a pleasure to be guest hosting It's the Democracy, Stupid, while Edwin is out for the day. I want to start with just talking to you for about a half hour, and then we'll get into some guests for the rest of the show and do some calls in the last half hour or so. Should probably start with who am I? I'm a political science professor at Loyola University, senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science, and also director of the African Studies and the African Diaspora Program. In addition, I'm a volunteer nonprofit executive. I've been president of 5 different organizations, done a bunch of different stuff in a bunch of different domestic and international fields. And currently, I'm a co-host of the World Discord podcast with Joel Ostro. I know he's been a guest on here many times before. And I'm the president of the Come Together Project, which is working on capitalism and democracy and trying to figure out how to bring people together in this country that's so divided right now. So I'll be bringing some of that to the table. Most of my academic side focuses on international relations, especially conflict and war for most of my career. I've done things with the United Nations, with the Middle East, with East Africa, most recently a lot of human rights work. And that's included some very local things, helping refugees and asylum seekers from Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda to testify for them as an expert witness and try to get them asylum inside the United States. So I'm very familiar with current politics there too. About 15 years ago or so, I started focusing on inequality globally and in the U.S., and that led me to some in-depth research on what we call capitalism. I say that because I don't think we know what that word means, and by extension to what we call democracy. Again, I don't think we really know what that word means. I'd like to start off every talk I give, every class, any radio show that I'm on with my bias. Why? Because I'm pretty sure everybody in the world is biased, and it is actually really important to understand the biases of the people that you are listening to and the people that you are talking with. And I've got some definite biases when it comes to democracy and economy and capitalism and some of the other subjects we'll be talking about today. So for me, in the best of all worlds, I think we want a system or government that is supposed to be all about maximizing freedom and liberty for all of us. And that's Republican, Democrat, everybody in the country. I think we all want freedom and liberty at a basic level. We want to do what we want to do. We want to be able to do anything we want to. Although I think a lot of the times when we're talking politics and on a lot of issues, we forget that there's a caveat to that. Freedom means that we get to do whatever we want to, so long as we don't harm anyone else. And that's one that I think is just incredibly important to bring into any conversation when we talk about I should be free to do something or I should have the liberty to do something, whether it's in business or in my personal life. I'm also a huge believer in strong communities and in building the strongest possible communities that we can, if for no other reason than building strong communities allows us to be stronger and better individuals. This is why we banded together in the first place, however many thousands and tens of thousands of years ago that human beings started coming together. We banded together then, we are still together now because we are better when we are in good communities. And politics right now, I think in some ways is all about how do we actually have the good community, or what is a good community and how do we get there. I'd suggest one of the problems in our society is the word freedom has been twisted all over the place. I'm going to go to a famous quote here. Bertrand Russell, philosopher and many other things, said the following: Advocates of capitalism are very apt to appeal to the sacred principles of liberty, which are embodied in one maximum: the most fortunate must not be restrained in the exercise of tyranny over the unfortunate. I think, sadly, that describes our system way too well. Russell was born in the 1800s, died in 1970. He saw it at that point in time, and I think that's even more true now. We have a system where the fortunate are not restrained in the exercise of tyranny over the rest of us. They use their money to get power and their power to get more money, and it's just a never-ending cycle. So right now, I'd actually suggest that we don't live in a democracy and we don't live in a capitalist system. And most of us don't even know it. Most of us don't even think about definitions for those things and what we should be shooting for. I love the fact that Edwin changed the name of the show from It's the Economy Stupid to It's the Democracy Stupid. I've really been focused ever since the Clinton campaign said those words in the 1990s on It's the Economy Stupid. I may not have loved everything Bill Clinton did, but he was absolutely right on that. And people who forget that don't win elections. I'd actually suggest that Donald Trump was laser focused in both the elections he won on the idea that it's the economy stupid. And I think that was a lot of his victory. He talked about the economy when the Democrats weren't doing it. And I think that in a lot of ways he convinced people and won elections because of that. But right now, what we're really saying is it's the democracy stupid, and that crosses over into the economy. Modern economists want us to focus and to separate economics and politics, and I think that's just insane. That's not realistic in any way, shape, or form. Economy and democracy are both incredibly important, and I would suggest that they are impossible to separate them apart. We have to deal with them together. So maybe let's do some quick definitions and just talk about where we're at with these things, with capitalism and democracy. Capitalism, when you go back to it, is supposed to be an efficient system based on openness and competition and free markets that leads to efficiency being the best possible prices for consumers. Capitalism originally is not about profits, and we have come to the point where most people define capitalism as getting the best profits. Problem right now is profits are only helping a small sliver of people, and they are frankly hurting the rest of us. Capitalism originally, the way Adam Smith put it together, is supposed to have government staying out of the market, but also, and this is the part people miss, the market's supposed to be out of government. Adam Smith was actually most concerned about business people, entrepreneurs, and merchants getting together and trying to influence the government. And he thought that would lead to basically what things have led to right now. We live in a system where the biggest players in the market control the government. They buy elections, they buy politicians, and they use them to enact laws that benefit themselves. And these laws often are things that hurt workers and hurt consumers, that hurt the rest of us. So what we end up with are monopolies and semi-monopolies and regulations or no regulations that benefit big businesses and laws that benefit big businesses. And altogether, these are pushing money up to the top and leaving the rest of us behind. And then we can talk about democracy too, because these are absolutely linked together here. We are typically taught that democracy is all about elections, and that's just not true. Every dictator, at least since World War II, holds elections every 4, 5, or 6 years, and they get themselves elected. They're often one-party elections. They're often tilted elections where everybody knows who's going to win in advance. They're fixed, but they have elections. And this is something that we're talking about in the U.S. and that we'll talk about with some of the guests on this show. We need to go beyond just elections, and we need to have free and fair elections, but also things like freedom of speech and a lot of the other freedoms that come with the Bill of Rights. What we forget, I think, about democracy can be summed up in two words. And I think they're the two most important words in political science and in society and in economy. And I teach about these in every class I teach in political science. The two words are who benefits. This is the most important question. If you're not sure why something's happening, ask yourself who benefits, and you are likely to get along the track to an answer. Now, in democracy, the people who are supposed to benefit are the people, all of us. Democracy is supposed to be a government that is by and for the people, and that is simply not what we have. Sure, we have elections, but we don't elect a government that helps the people. Our elections are bought with lobbying and bought with advertising and bought with money from super PACs and from big influential organizations. And the government that we get benefits the people who spent the money on the elections. And we see that over and over and over again. And that's only gotten worse, at least since the 1980s, for the past 45 plus years. I think at best, we're not a democracy. At best, we're an oligarchy ruled by a small few. I think it's much more likely we should describe ourselves as a plutocracy that's ruled by and for the rich. And lately, I've been coming to think that more and more we're becoming an aristocracy in many ways. We've got some ruling families that keep passing money down, and their kids get all the benefits. Their kids go to the best schools. Their kids take over their businesses. Their kids take over their hundreds of millions and billions. And their kids then control us in future generations. None of these things benefit the people, and that is an important thing that we need to focus on. Another one of those questions that's out there, we're taught that big government is bad. It was Ronald Reagan who first said this in the public eye and in politics. Big government is bad and small government is good. This is classic neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, and everything that Reagan and Margaret Thatcher spread. And what we know, because we're living in it right now, is government is corrupt. And government is inefficient. And there's a lot of things we shouldn't like about government right now. Most of the time, it is corrupt. It's absolutely problematic for the rest of us. But this is not a question of big versus small government. This is not a question of size in government. I think the proper question should be, who is the government working for? It doesn't matter if it's big or small. It's what is the government accomplishing? What is the government trying to do? And what is the government doing? Because what we have is a government that benefits the people at the top. And they pass laws and regulations and set up systems and set up an economy, frankly, that benefit people at the top. Our government, in a lot of ways, is set up to be inefficient. And for the people at the top, the smaller it is, the better it is for them. So people at the top want a weak IRS. They want an IRS that can audit us and can control us because we pay money to the IRS through our paychecks, but that has no control over them because they don't pay things through paychecks and their taxes are complicated and they've got rich accountants and lawyers to help them not pay taxes. And the result's been, really since the Obama administration, the rich have paid very little in taxes and in many cases haven't even needed to file taxes because they understand they're not going to get audited because the IRS doesn't have enough staff members to audit them because the politicians that they've put in office have cut the budget of the IRS. It's amazing the way these things work when you drill down through the system. Education's very similar. Yeah, we've got a bad public education system in most places. Now, if you live in one of those zip codes with a really high income, you're going to have great public education there because the rich people want their own kids to be educated well. But consider the possibility that our public education system is a problem because that's benefiting somebody. It's benefiting the people who own the big corporations who don't really need educated employees. They want compliant employees. They want employees who'll do what they're told. And these people certainly don't want an educated population. They certainly don't want citizens who might vote against them and citizens who might realize that the interests of the rich are not the interests of everybody else. Social Security, the same thing. We could fully fund Social Security just by actually taxing the people at the top who don't pay Social Security taxes after the first $400,000 right now. Healthcare, we could have a great healthcare system, except that our healthcare system is for profit, and the government protects that for-profit healthcare system. We don't need a system where the government provides all of our health care. Most of Europe has systems with private doctors where you get to prick your doctor, and then you and your doctor make the choices about your health care, and it gets paid for either by the government or sometimes it's paid for by private insurance companies, but they're not allowed to make a profit off of our health. These are the things that our system has set up, and they are not benefiting us. What do we want? We want the kind of stuff that people have started talking about just in the last year. We want jobs. We want better Social Security where you don't raise the retirement age all the time. You raise the benefits. Why doesn't anybody ever talk about that? We want health care that you don't lose when you lose your job, that you don't lose when you get a disease, that doesn't put you into bankruptcy when your kid has something horrible happen to them. We want child care that we can afford. We don't want pollution. Forget about climate change. Yeah, if you understand climate change, that's a gigantic issue. But nobody in this country wants a plant that pollutes in their neighborhood. Nobody wants to have to drink polluted water or have polluted ground around them and have everybody in the community getting cancer by the time they're 40 years old. That's universal. That crosses political parties. We all want clean water to drink. And the watchword right now is affordability. We all want affordability. We need affordability. Someplace between 75 and 80% of us are basically living paycheck to paycheck, and one bad crisis is going to put us under. This looks like a broken system. It looks like something that's not working. You know what? It is a broken system, but it's broken on purpose. It is working exactly the way that the people at the top have set it up to work. It is working to benefit them. And if we want to make this system better, we need to recognize that it's working really well for some people. And that's a big thing that we need to change. So for me, this is all about getting both the government and an economic system that works for the people, not just for the rich elites at the top. This means at some basic level, we need a meaningful democracy. We need a democracy that actually is by and for the people. And we need a meaningful economic system, an economic system based around the needs of workers and consumers, not just based around profits for the rich that never, ever trickle down. Imagine an economic system based around workers. Why is it that the people who get the profits get to say everything that the corporation does and just give us a salary and they take all the rest? Why not have the workers run the company, have the workers have an ownership interest in the company, and those worker owners can elect the leaders of the company? We need CEOs and CFOs and all that other stuff to run the stuff at the top, but the workers who know the business best could have a hand in doing that. Believe it or not, this is something that people on the left and the right in the United States want. Polls show this all the time, but it wouldn't benefit the people at the top, so it gets fought and tooth and claw all the time. This stuff brings up a lot of issues, and we'll talk about some of those issues today. Leadership, or the lack thereof, and where it's taking us. This is really a key thing. I'm going to get another one of those famous quotes here. George Orwell from 1984 and other books has, frankly, way too many quotes about our current situation in the country and in the world. And I'll just use one of them here from Orwell. Democracy fails not only when leaders lie, but when citizens stop caring whether they are being lied to. I think we've been living that for the past 20 plus years. We're in what's now called the post-truth society. You've heard that at least since George W. Bush and probably since Newt Gingrich in 1994. We're in a society where the news doesn't tell the truth. Politicians don't tell the truth, and we kind of expect that. We now take it as normal that we're not going to get the truth. We take it as normal that newscasters don't actually ask for the truth and push for it. They have a Democrat in, the Democrat says one thing, the Republican on the other side says the opposite, and the person on the news says, thank you very much for joining us, instead of challenging them, instead of actually pushing for the truth. The people at the top want us to be frustrated. They want us to think that politics is bad and politics isn't working for them, and it's useless for us to try to do anything about politics. And the reasons they want that is that pushes us to inactivity. That pushes us to not be good citizens. That pushes us to not pay attention because we assume that all the politicians are bad and that we can't possibly have a good system. That pushes us to do very little other than vote, and sometimes we don't even vote. This isn't just about Donald Trump, no matter how much we focus on him right now. Our current version of government and the economy has been in the works for at least the past 45 years, since the early 1980s. Things that are problematic now, we focus on individuals and rugged individuals instead of focusing on community. We focus on profits instead of focusing on what's good for all of us. We've made consensus a dirty word. Our politicians aren't allowed to work together, or they become rhinos, Republicans in name only, or they become false Democrats. And a lot of my friends on the left fight nonstop. If you're not a progressive, you're not doing this right, and you're not a progressive because you've got this one thing wrong, and you're not a left, you're a lefty, or whatever the case might be. We fight about that stuff instead of trying to find what we have in common. And they separate us into opposing camps. They separate us into sports teams. They have set up the culture wars. There have been think tanks that have been set up and paid for to design these issues. And those culture wars both divide us and they distract us from what is really going on. What this is really all about is money and power, that question of who benefits. The rich use their money to influence politics and buy power. Then they use their power to set up laws, so they benefit even more and they get more influence. And then they use that to get more money and more power. I'm going to turn here to our guests. And my guests today are a great variety. I've got 4 different guests coming in. We're going to start with Kitty Kurth, the president of Kurth Lampe Worldwide, a public relations and political strategy firm based in Chicago. Then we'll go to Dan Tully, candidate for Congress in the 9th District and a veteran attorney and civil servant. He was in the Judge Advocate General's Corps in the U.S. Army. Peter Shane's an American legal scholar and author who focuses on democracy, Constitution, and the president. And Susan Cork is the executive director of the Democracy Defenders Action, a bipartisan team fighting autocracy and protecting the Constitution. And then stick around. We'll leave 30 minutes at the end for your questions, and you can call in. The number to reach the studio is 773-763-9278. And I hope to talk to you later today.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Y'all know this isn't the only show on WCPT. Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central, WCPT's Scott Duff and Ellen Miller invite you to spend Sunday brunch with your gay best friends. Each week on Out Chicago, they tackle today's headlines from a queer perspective and focus on the accomplishments of the vibrant LGBTQ community in Chicago and across the globe. Out Chicago is Chicago's only live broadcast for the LGBTQ community. And now, hey, let's go to my first guest. My first guest is an old friend, so we're just going to be chatting for about 25 or 30 minutes here. Kitty Kurth is the president of Kurth Lampe Worldwide. It's a public relations and political strategy firm based in Chicago that's done numerous local, state, national, and international campaigns and has had clients over the years in all those areas. She's been a press secretary, communications director, campaign manager for candidates, and she's worked in the last 8 presidential campaigns. Kitty and I can talk about almost anything, but one of the things that's been on her mind lately have been the far-right and anti-democratic movements that are spreading not just here, but around the world. Viktor Orban in Hungary and others. And Kitty, how you doing today? Let's start talking about that.
I'm doing great, Brian. It's really good to be with you. I find it very funny to be on Edwin's show for the first time with you because I've actually been friends with Edwin and known Edwin since before he was an alderman. So,
yep, I think we met him at the same time, or you might have introduced me to Edwin 30, 40 years ago, something like that.
Yes. So, and we'll see later if we have time to talk about Edwin's creative problem-solving techniques, because I think he had some of the best when he was alderman, involving dog biscuits.
The listeners might like that too much.
But let's talk about the far right and particularly Hungary.
Yeah, so we've got Trump here on the far right, and everybody knows that, but Trump had a demonstration effect, and he wasn't the first far right person in the world. So what are you thinking about Viktor Orban these days?
Well, let's circle back to Viktor Orban in the old days first. And do you know the name Sebastian Gorka, Brian?
It is familiar, yes. Please tell us about him.
Well, you know, Sebastian Gorka was in the first Trump administration and is in the second Trump administration as a counterterrorism czar. But way back when, before he came to the U.S., he was in Hungary and he was organizing on the far right. Some say with people with Nazi links, but generally on the far right. And you know who else has been in Hungary for a long time, covering Hungary?
I'm certain you're going to tell me, Kitty.
A little news organization called Breitbart.
Yes. It's all coming together now.
Right? And a guy named Steve Bannon, who works for Breitbart now, has been over in Hungary I was trying to find the name of the castle or what it is, but he was like up in some castle that I think was an old mission, but I could be totally wrong about that. But Steve Bannon has been educating Europeans about the far right and how to organize in Hungary for decades, going back. Maybe not decades. I could be exaggerating. You know, I never exaggerate.
No, not at all.
At least since before 2016. And what's really crazy is Hungary is the most corrupt state in the EU, the state that blocks the most aid to Ukraine and the most help. They are anti-NATO and anti-EU in the midst of NATO and in the midst of the EU.
Yeah, and it's causing a lot of problems in the EU now in terms of what they want to do. I just want to lay this out here, though, because we live in interesting times. Everything that you just said, Sebastian Gorka and Steve Bannon, who ran Trump's first campaign and who basically ran the White House effectively the first time around, and Viktor Orban all coming together. This would be a conspiracy theory even 10 or 15 years ago, and people would look at us like we're crazy. And now we're just kind of saying facts. This is Wikipedia level stuff. It's freaking insane.
Not only is it facts, it's history now.
Yeah.
That's the crazy part. It's been happening since before 2016. And the fact that Orban is, we can go into what he's done in Hungary, but let's look at what he's done that people in the United States should care about and should be worried about. He is the direct link. He might not be the historical direct link, but now he is the direct link and the direct communicator between Putin and Trump.
Yeah.
And the triumvirate in his mind, in Trump's mind, in Putin's mind, and in the minds of a lot of his supporters in Hungary is the Putin-Trump-Orban axis.
Yep. Yeah, and we need to talk about how important this is, because in the past year, and it really is now being highlighted with the Orban presidential campaign that we'll talk about. In the past year, though, Trump and the Trump administration, and J.D. Vance very vocally among others, have been stepping out in favor of far-right parties all across Europe. And it is considered a problem for freedom of speech, and it is officially United States policy now. It's not freedom of speech if you ban far-right parties, which was typical. We're talking Nazis here. We're talking fascist parties.
Right.
And the U.S. administration is saying you can't ban those. And a lot of this starts and is directed at their friend Viktor Orban, but then it spreads across to other parties in other countries.
There's numerous, documented collusion, for lack of a better word, between the Trump administration and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom. There is all of this, what you could nicely call meddling, but I think the term is election interference.
Oh, yeah.
And election interference, you're the professor. Hasn't that always been considered, if not illegal, improper?
Oh, yeah. It's against U.S. law, not just for people to do it in other countries, but technically, depending on how we do it, for us to do it to others. Now, we've done it for years through things like Voice of America and those types of things, but we're getting some very direct election influence now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but to me, it felt pretty weird to see J.D. Vance openly campaigning for Orban last week. That was just extraordinary to me.
Yeah, the election is tomorrow, right?
The election is tomorrow. So, Hungary being, 6 or 7 hours earlier than Chicago, we should have some initial results in during our daytime tomorrow, but then the Hungarian process is a little bit spread out, so we might not know everything until Monday.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing to me that J.D. Vance goes over there and it's seen as a positive by Orban and his campaign. I just can't imagine a U.S. vice president being beneficial to a presidential campaign in an Eastern European country. This is so freaking weird.
Brian, the world is, the world is turned upside down. Cats and dogs are living together.
J.D. Vance couldn't get his brother elected mayor in Ohio.
Well, and we'll see whether he will be able to help get Orban elected or whether anyone will. I mean, that's the other interesting thing. Peter Magyar, Orban's opponent, has been gaining ground in the polling that's been done over there.
How far behind
Some of
is Orban right now?
Sorry?
How far behind is Orban right now? I've heard he's dropping pretty
Well,
far back.
the poll that I was reading today, and it was from Atlas International, which has a good history of prediction, has him like around 40%, and Magyar up around 52%,
Yeah, that's huge.
which is huge. Now, having said that, Brian, you and I are from Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
We know the power of incumbency. We know strange things can happen on election day.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was Stalin or the first Mayor Daley who said it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes. It was one of those guys who talked about it.
Maybe they both said it.
It could be.
But so I don't know who's going to win tomorrow. I really don't. But theoretically, I would rather be in the Magyar campaign today than in the Orban campaign today.
The other thing is, and I'm not as familiar with this as you are, so you may or may not have an answer on this one. If Orban leaves, does he leave office, or does he have enough police military power to stay in office? Do they stop being a democracy at that point?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know. And I earlier in my life, when I was sassier and less intelligent, I would have been happy to make predictions about elections. But at this point in my life, I really don't make any predictions about any elections anymore, because I'm a history major, and I always thought that you could predict things based on how things go historically. But since Urban's been in office for 16 years, I might add, consecutively, he's thrown out their constitution, he's emaciated the judiciary, he's done all kinds of things that I would have said at the beginning of his reign of terror that you wouldn't be able to get away with in a liberal democracy, which was what Hungary was aspiring to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And now it's really an illiberal democracy in many ways. And liberal democracy, by the way, is not necessarily the highest possible level because it doesn't have all the freedoms. But illiberal democracy is even worse.
Right. And unfortunately, when you read about the traits of an illiberal democracy and about what has happened in Hungary, it's really easy to see why Trump admires him so much, because what Orban has been able to do in Hungary is exactly what Trump is trying to do in the United States of America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Trump is looking at the dictators all around the world, but it's people like Orban who are technically in a democracy that I think Trump feels the most affection toward, whatever the case might be, the most affiliation with, that are the biggest possibilities for him come 2028, because that's one of the many things that Trump's looking at right now.
Yeah, because if they can do it, why can't he?
Exactly. No,
if it's good
absolutely.
Enough. And I think we haven't even talked about what's the power that Hungary is holding over all of Europe right now.
Yeah, it's horrific.
But the audience might know that you're an expert in the United Nations and how the United Nations works, and how just one vote on the Security Council can hold up things, can skew things. And that's what's really happening in the European Union right now. Because Hungary won't vote on funding for Ukraine, won't vote on other things, the whole of Europe is being stifled and held up. The fact that the EU has pledged all this money, but to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian efforts against Russia, but they can't execute because Orban is holding up the actual funding.
Yeah, absolutely. It was hard enough for Europe while Biden was in office to decide what they wanted to do. And they had a lot of contests about that and a lot of disagreements about that. When Trump came into office, one of the interesting things that happened was he kind of brought Europe together, not with the United States, obviously, but he brought Europe together in recognizing that if they didn't support Ukraine, nobody was going to. And now they've got this one country and one leader, Hungary and Orban, that's standing in the way of the European Union doing things. And we have seen some individual European countries, but the European Union is much more powerful and frankly just has more money on these things when they work together. So it is a nasty part of international democracy and international affairs here. You're absolutely right.
And it's such a Trumpy thing because Trump is complaining about Europe not stepping up and not doing more. And then at the same time, he's supporting Orban, who's the guy that's stopping Europe from doing more.
Yeah, and Trump is totally transactional on these things too. So I'm not surprised at all. But yes, that's definitely what it's coming down to.
And earlier in the show, I heard you talking about who benefits and who benefits from both Orban and Trump and how they are conducting themselves in their own countries in the world. Who benefits?
Seems that there might be some money coming out of the Trump family that might be doing that.
But that's not the one I was thinking of.
Where were you going?
The one I was thinking of was Putin.
Ah, yes.
Putin is benefiting from all of this because Ukraine isn't getting the monetary support. And then when we talked about the European Union, but Hungary is also a part of NATO.
Yep.
And Orban has also been hanging up votes in NATO and hanging up support, stalling support for Ukraine in NATO.
And that is Putin's primary goal in invading Ukraine, is to weaken the EU and NATO. He might get more than that. He was hopeful he'd get more than that, but he wanted this attack to weaken them, and it's doing it again.
So my theory and fear is, 50 years from now, when you and I are sadly probably both gone, people are going to look back on this and, rather than calling this the Trump era, I think they're going to be calling it the Putin era, because globally, he's the guy that is ultimately benefiting all over the place.
Yeah, he's just kind of behind the scenes. I still think Trump's going to get Times Man of the Year. I actually, just like when Hitler got it, I cannot imagine a person who's been more important to the world at the moment than Donald Trump. Not in good ways, but he's insanely important.
As you and I know, as you know, I spend a lot of time in Sweden and have done a lot of things in Swedish politics, and it's the same over there. They feel trapped by what Trump is doing, and what Trump is doing vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia affects them directly.
Yeah.
They have had to remobilize their military. They've been neutral for all these years, but they've had to. Pardon me, they've had to bulk up their military because of Trump.
And now you look at the war in Iran, and it's got the ramifications there too. So the war in Iran raises oil prices, which means that Russia can better afford the war in Ukraine, which means that Europe and the U.S. gets less oil, which leads to Trump opening up Russian oil and taking sanctions off Russian oil, which all benefits Vladimir Putin.
I was just going to go there, Brian. That's why I like you.
It's
you
amazing.
Can read my mind. It's crazy. Not only is Iran, which Trump thinks is our, horrible adversary and enemy right now. I don't know what they've actively been doing to us before we invaded them, but that's another story. But, all of a sudden they're making twice as much every day on oil as they had been before the war. And they're going to be able to charge tolls in the Straits of Hormuz, which never happened. Like, I just don't get what his purpose was.
Well, and this is totally different subject, but we can go a little bit here, and I've got a guest later who's going to talk about some of this too. But what we're looking at with the Iran situation is we were successful in killing some people at the top. We did not get rid of the regime. We did not get regime change. We did not get rid of the nuclear weapons. But now take a look at who's negotiating over there. And it is J.D. Vance, who may or may not be being set up as a fall guy here. We'll see what actually happens out of that. And then it is Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who are the primary people since Trump's first term who are responsible for raking in the money for the Trump organization and Trump family. Kushner came out of the first Trump administration and within a year had a couple $2 billion of Saudi money invested in his organization, and he's just kept pushing it since that point in time. A lot of his quote-unquote negotiations in the Middle East are negotiations with people for private business deals, and that's why he was sent over there. So none of this is good for the United States. None of this is good for the rest of the world, but it is good for a small number of people, and they're trying to keep it hidden.
Absolutely right. And I'm going to hopefully segue you right into your next guest. But I was over in the UAE in January. I was in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. We had a bunch of great meetings about bringing Emirati investment to the United States and particularly to Illinois. We were there on a trade mission, and we had great meetings. And the Emiratis were like, "We love Trump. He's been over here. Jared's been here. We want to do business. We want to invest. We want to build data centers all over the United States. We want United States students to come and get their education in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, and all of this great trade back and forth." But since we bombed Iran, which is, the Straits of Hormuz, when you're in Dubai, you're way closer to Iran than when you're in Chicago looking at Michigan.
Oh, yeah. No, it's not a big waterway.
Closer.
Yeah.
No, it's very small. And now that, and then Iran's been bombing you all over UAE, well, all of a sudden, the Emiratis are not feeling so friendly toward the United States.
Right.
So what is that going to do to blow up all the investments that were in the pipeline?
Absolutely. We've heard of a couple of those crashing already in the last few days, but we turned our closest allies into victims over there, except, of course, for Israel. But in terms of everybody else in the Gulf, we turned our Gulf allies into victims. And as much as this is affecting international economy, it's going to affect their economies significantly more for many, many years to come.
Yep. And between him, I don't get what the end game is. Between him turning all of our allies in the Middle East against us, turning all of our NATO allies, he's trying his best to turn all of our NATO allies against us. What's the end game?
So I'm going to put something out here, and this is a personal take on Trump, but I think it's completely consistent with what we know about him from people in the first administration, from books written about him. Hell, just go back to Art of the Deal. And he said a lot of it himself. We need to remember that we say Trump is narcissistic and that he's totally into himself. We say that Trump is transactional and he goes from one thing to the next, that he only pays attention to what's in front of him. I think we need to take those things seriously. And a human being who fits that description doesn't have an end game. That's not the way someone with those personality traits is going to think. So I'd suggest we shouldn't want it both ways, that, what's Trump's end game, except he's not the kind of person who has an end game. I think we just need to realize we probably went into this with no strategy, which is looking at a few tactical things, and with no end game and no clue how we were going to get out. And that's really important when you're talking about the potential, how do we solve this and what what are the answers. At most, the end game is, get Witkoff and get Kushner some more exposure over there to more people so that at the end we can get it back. And even this, proof of this, you look at Trump, the minute the Iranians talk about putting tolls on things going through, Trump comes out with an announcement that, oh yeah, we're going to share in those tolls and we'll split those tolls with Iran. Never consulted anyone but himself on that, of course.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I heard last week somebody talking about Trump's brain and how he doesn't make connections between like cause and effect.
Right.
Or this is going to happen and then that's going to happen. And if you can't make connections, I guess you're not going to figure out that if you bomb Iran, oil prices are going to go up. And the price at the pump that Americans are paying is going to go up, and diesel is going to go up, and farmers are going to be hurt.
Yeah, and this is a problem. We'll get to this in the next hour, but this is a problem with Trump's cabinet and with the advisors around him. Most of them are complete yes men and yes women, and even the ones who aren't are people who are cowed and who maybe put out a perspective once. So, we know now from a New York Times reporting that J.D. Vance was originally against the war, and he was one of the only voices fighting against it, but nobody else was there. And at some point, he just gave up and started focusing on how to do what the emperor wants done. And that's not a good way to fight.
I'm still looking for the peace president, but maybe we'll see him. He
was a damn peace president for the first 4 years. It's the one thing I gave Trump credit for. He actually didn't get us into very much, if anything, the first 4 years in office. He was better than a lot of people on that. And now he just does a total 180 after all of his promises. And is, how many wars has he started in an attempt to get the Nobel Peace Prize?
Which, I don't know. To my way of thinking, it seems bass-backwards, but what do I know?
Just a little bit. It's not like you're a political consultant who's been doing these things for many, many years right now. All right, we got about 2 or 3 minutes, Kitty. Any final burning topics that you wanted to get to that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I just think on this thing, I've been fixated on the rise of the far right across the world for years and years and years. And I would love for CPT listeners to go and do a little bit of investigation because, in our world, everything really is connected. And the internet has connected all of us in a really good way. So you can connect to your friends from grade school or, your grandchildren, whatever. But the other thing that it's really connected is the far right movements around the globe. And if people think that what's happening here in the United States with the disinformation that we get from Russian news sources is disconnected to the disinformation that people in Hungary are getting before their election, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell them because it's all connected. And the rise of the right can also be tracked with the rise of disinformation. I am not saying that one causes the other, but it is more than coincidental, the timing of everything. And, we're living in a world where you can't really take things for granted and you've got to look beneath the surface. And I know everybody's busy and I know everybody's got to, get to their soccer game and get to their baseball game. But what you were saying earlier in the hour, Brian, about democracy is really true. It's here, and what do they say? Democracy is nice if you can keep it.
Yep.
Well,
messy.
if we want to keep it, people do have to be involved. It is a spectator sport. And you were bumming me out a little bit with you made it sound very, very negative about the future.
I leave it to the guests to get us back up again.
But I think that there is still democracy there. And especially the closer to home, in these last elections in Illinois, we found a lot of really good grassroots victories for progressives in places like Lake County and DuPage County, which are historically Republican.
Yeah.
If you look at what just happened in Wisconsin and the Supreme Court race, they're in Western Racine County, which has historically been as red as DuPage County used to be. The Supreme Court justice won the race. The Democratic Supreme Court justice won the race.
Yep.
So I want you to leave your listeners
shall.
with a positive attitude.
We shall, absolutely. There's a lot you can find here. Also, by the way, it's not just demonstration effect. There's a lot of the same things happening to people that are pushing people to the right. So there are affordability crises, and that leads to a lot of the anti-refugee stuff. We've got similar problems, and we can have similar solutions if we figure out how to work together on them. And Kitty, with that, I will say thank you very much for joining us. Kitty Kurth, president of Kurth Lampe Worldwide. And if I'm ever doing a show again, you're, of course, always welcome back on.
All right. Well, always good to talk to you, Brian, and always good to come together.
Thanks, Kitty.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Hello again, folks. Welcome back. I want to remind you, on Monday, we've got Choose Views. Richard Chu's guests are going to be William Elliott Hazelgrove. He's the author of Capone's Vault, the real story of the biggest disaster in television history, available on April 16th. He's also going to have Sarah Jones, the managing editor and co-publisher of Politicus USA and the Daily Politicus, and Rich Logus of Leaving MAGA. Choose Views runs weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. Central on WCPT, 820 a.m. Also on the Heartland Signal website. That's all one word, Heartland Signal. Tune in, YouTube, and Facebook. And now I'm pleased to have our next guest on. Dan Tully was a candidate for Congress in the 8th District. I apologize, I said 9th before. He's a veteran attorney and civil servant who served 7.5 years as a judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserve, including over 3.5 years on active duty. While deployed to Iraq, Dan advised commanders on operations to defeat ISIS. At Fort Bragg, Dan served in the headquarters of the Green Berets to facilitate intelligence investigations, and he supported the 82nd Airborne Division. Dan's one of these guys who was in the middle of some of the military legal things we've been talking about, so I definitely want to get to that. First, Dan, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Brian. I really appreciate this opportunity to join you.
Yeah, really happy to have you on. Let's take a couple minutes at the beginning just for your recent life. I'm sorry you didn't win in the race, but maybe you can give us a few thoughts now that the race is over, where you think we need to be going with this.
Of course. And I want to say at the outset that after some analysis of why I lost, I determined that I didn't get as many votes as the person who won, and I don't want to attribute the loss to anything other than that.
I think that's genius.
Absolutely. I want to congratulate Melissa Bean on her victory, and now that we're headed into the general election, I'm 100% behind her. Want to make sure that we're successful as Democrats in November, and I'm going to do whatever I can to support that victory. I should also add here at the outset that I have certainly served that number of years, about 8.5 in the Army Reserve. But joining you today, Saturday, April 11th, in my personal capacity, as my status right now is such that I'm free to speak in my civilian thoughts. But certainly from this perspective of having just recently, within the last month, completed a campaign for Congress, I think even zooming out from my race, the 8th District alone, there are some concerning trends across the state. Number one, I would point out, is the role of big money in politics, not just obviously in my race, but even across the 4 open contested seats, and not just in federal, across state seats as well.
Absolutely. We
saw large super PACs get involved, and whether they be aligned with foreign affairs or aligned with AI development. We saw in multiple races multi-million-dollar contributions being made within the last few weeks to really change the ability for candidates to get their messages out. And so I think that the candidates who did win their respective races I would hope that we could continue to encourage them to find a way to pursue campaign finance reform, whether that be, and I think all the steps are needed, removing Citizens United and basically barring corporations from making political contributions, and of course barring anonymous, unchecked amounts of money being poured into our elections. There's so much that we can do in that space, and I hope that the folks who did prevail in these primaries will continue in that regard. The other thing I would just flag is not with respect to my specific race, of course, but looking across all the races, at least at the congressional level, no one who won their primary won with a majority of votes. And so I'm really interested in the idea of ranked choice voting, which would basically allow voters to ensure that whoever is representing them had the widest support possible from the electorate, especially when we have such large primary fields. I think those could be really important reforms to pursue. But, at the end of the day, those who won this election won fair and square in the rules that currently exist, and want to make sure that we can get them to Congress in November.
Yeah, no, I love those ideas, and I think those are incredibly important things to focus on. You've hit the nail on the head, and it really showed up in some of these Illinois elections as far as the money that was pumped in, not just pumped into candidates to help them win, but pumped into opponents to try to get somebody to lose, and they're doing sneaky stuff behind the scenes on that, too. It's not always straightforward, but completely agree. Finance reform, incredibly important. And yeah, ranked choice voting is something that I think their time has come. They've got a few places that do it already, but this is something that I agree we can certainly look into, and we'll see how the Congress goes. That's really, I think, going to be a big piece of it, whether some of that can get started now, and then we'll see what happens in 28, because that all comes down to the politics of it. But excellent ideas, and thank you for putting them out there. I do want to turn to your Army job, and I've got many friends in the military, so thank you for the disclaimer that this is in your personal capacity. That's incredibly important. You are a JAG officer, or a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General, and the U.S. military has been eliminating a lot of JAG officers, not just in military courts, but also, importantly, legal advisors. And now we've heard a lot of suggestions of war crimes and even genocide by the Trump administration, both in Venezuela and now in Iran. What's the deal with that, Dan? What should we be looking at? What's really happening? What should the legal advisors be doing here on the military side?
Of course, and the specific questions about Venezuela and Iran, they fit neatly under this administration's approach to the rule of law more broadly, where this president doesn't like to see any restraints on his authority. And so when it comes to exercising his war power, the president doesn't even observe congressional authority in the constitutionally designated role of declaring war. He sees the military as his own instrument to express his authoritarian and his imperial aspirations. And he's empowered by the people he's chosen to put in roles of consequence. Specifically, I look at Pete Hegseth and his rise. He made no secret, even before he became Secretary of Defense, that he didn't really value the role that JAG officers played, and he would refer to them in his book as JAG-offs, and say that they were impediments to accomplishing the mission. And now that he is Secretary of Defense, step after step he's taken really highlight his disdain for restraints. You need only look at his first month into the job. He fired the top-ranking Judge Advocate Generals across the services, saying that they would be roadblocks to pursuing the president's agenda.
Exactly.
Later on, he reassigned over 600 JAGs from across the branches to the Department of Justice to serve as immigration court judges. Immigration court, of course, in immigration cases have no military nexus whatsoever, and judge advocates are not trained in practicing immigration law. It was just a way to repurpose and move JAG lawyers outside of the military so that they wouldn't get in the way of him accomplishing what he wants to do. But then when we look at the specific operations that you mentioned, whether that be Venezuela or Iran. We see a president who is basically doing whatever he wants to do with the military with no one there to stop him, as Congress, controlled, of course, by Republican leadership, isn't willing to step up. In the case of Venezuela, the president acted without even telling any member of Congress, even though he told the oil company executives that he was hoping would benefit from the operation.
So he briefed the important people, is what we're saying here, at least from his perspective.
He briefed the people whose pocketbooks are linked in some way with his, but certainly not the members of Congress whose role it is to act as a check on presidential power. And then, of course, when it comes to Iran, we can break it down on two different levels. One, the purpose of going to war, that's the just ad bellum analysis, the reason why we're going to war. And this is a war of aggression. Let's make no mistake about it. This is an illegal war. The purpose, there was no self-defense constraint. I know that the president has mentioned that we were trying to prevent nuclear weapons from being obtained, but there's no argument whatsoever that has any credence to it about imminence there. This is truly a war of aggression that violates our obligations under the UN Charter. So the whole underlying war is illegal, and yet we can break it down by the actual practice of war. That's jus in bello. That's the actual conduct of the war. And we see illegal aspects of the war being prosecuted as well. For instance, targeting civilian infrastructure. When we're blowing up bridges, when we're blowing up, we're threatening to blow up desalination plants and civilian infrastructure, that itself is illegal under our own obligations under international law. And international law isn't simply a suggestion. It's incorporated into our law by our own actions, as it requires Senate consent to the treaties that we've signed on to, but also presidential involvement. Then the most significant thing, the most significant presidential proclamation that I've ever heard in my lifetime occurred this week when the President of the United States posted that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again if his demands weren't met. That itself is a threat of genocide. And when I heard it, there's really only one way to wipe out a civilization. That's nuclear weapons. That was, in my understanding, the president threatening to use nuclear weapons to kill a country, an entire civilization. That itself is genocide, and threatening genocide, threatening war crimes, that's illegal under the U.S. War Crimes Act in 96.
So, Dan, let's unpack a lot of this stuff, because you just made about 10 excellent points, and I made a few notes here. So let's take them one or two at a time. First, I just want to agree with a couple things. The idea that people from the Judge Advocate General can do immigration law. I deal with immigration law all the time. That's an administrative judge with training who's doing those things, and it's not at all what people in the JAG Corps are trained for. So that's huge. Also, I'm glad you mentioned U.S. law and the Constitution and treaties. This is something a lot of people don't think about, and it's been preeminent in my mind lately. It's not that these are laws that are convenient for us to ignore and that we're powerful, so we only follow international law when we want to. When we ratify international law, according to Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution of the United States, that treaty becomes the law of the land, equal to any other law or to the Constitution. We have to follow it as if it is the law of the land. And my expertise, I was mentioning at the beginning of the show, I do a lot of war stuff. My expertise is genocide and war crimes. And you're absolutely right. We've violated the Genocide Convention by threats. We are violating the Geneva Conventions by threats and by actions. So these are all gigantic issues. I want to ask you to give us the realistic side of some things, because you're a soldier and you are advising soldiers. You're the people advising the people whose job is to go out there and fulfill the orders of the commander-in-chief and arguably kill people in many circumstances and commit extreme violent acts. But you're talking to us here about just war theory, the jus ad bellum and jus ad bellum, very familiar with the concepts. but just war theory is often thought of as something that's idealistic. How important is that when you would be advising someone on how the U.S. should go into a war or should conduct a war? Really, just how important is the law, whether international or U.S. military code of justice and law? How important is that in the decisions that our commanders should be making and would normally be making?
I think it's incredibly important, and this set of wars aside, Venezuela and Iran, looking back throughout our history, we've seen presidents of both parties really stress and consider very carefully whether or not to commit U.S. troops, even looking back at what's often seen as a mistake now, but Bush's decision to go into Iraq in 2003, there was over a year of lead up of a period where he was trying to explain the purpose and the role of the U.S. military action. There were people in our government who had good faith belief, it seemed, that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, we can look back and see that was a mistake, but at the same time, there was at least an attempt to explain why that military action was needed and why we were going to risk American lives and American blood and American treasure on this purpose of going into another country, even in a war of invasion like in Iraq. But now the president didn't even bother telling his own vice president. I saw recent reporting. He didn't tell Tulsi Gabbard, his DNI, his director of national intelligence, about Venezuela. He obviously didn't inform Congress and didn't inform the American people. There doesn't seem to be any value that he places in explaining the purpose why he wants to go and accomplish this. And so when you ask about military commanders making decisions, the military will go where the civilian leadership tells them to go. And so long as the orders are legal, they'll perform the orders. I shuddered this week to think of those who are on active duty right now and who would have been involved in an order coming down from the President of the United States to actually take action to wipe out an entire civilization. I want to believe that our members of the military on active duty would somehow would recognize that is illegal and wouldn't pursue it, but at the same time, the president and Pete Hegseth have taken deliberate steps to remove people from military command who stand in the way, and not just the judge advocates. We look last year at the commander of SOUTHCOM, the Geographic Combat Command for South America. Yep,
and last week the chief of the Army and a couple of other generals were also removed. That's scary stuff.
Exactly. You're spot on. The explanation for SOUTHCOM commander being removed was that he didn't like the boat strikes that were going on, which are war crimes, and I've argued that in a Tribune op-ed a couple months ago. But as you said, the Army chief of staff, he was removed because, based on public reporting, it sounds like he doesn't want to have ground troops committed in Iran. And so as we see the president and Pete Hegseth moving through military leaders and casting them aside if they stand in their way, you have to wonder the people that are in the positions of power that ascend to those positions, how committed they are to standing up against this president, or if they're handpicked to actually facilitate this president's agenda.
Yeah, and we also have some reporting from the New York Times last week. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on it or if you saw it, the article about what happened in the White House Situation Room in the lead up to Iran, and a number of people who were talked about, but apparently Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, was in there. And my understanding is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when they're sitting in that room, have two responsibilities. One is to give their own perspective on what's happening, and then the other is to tell the president how to best fulfill the orders that the president wants to give. And the things that we've heard out of there is it sounds like General Kane didn't do the first, that he really didn't give his own perspective at all. There are a number of people who say they believe that he was opposed to it, but he didn't put that out there at all. He just told the president what the president wanted to hear in terms of how things might happen. If that's the case, would that be something that's a dereliction of duty? Is that something that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs should do, to the best of your knowledge? Are there legal responsibilities there? Kind of fill us in a little bit on what might be going on behind the scenes there.
Well, without any direct knowledge, I've never been in the situation, but I do know generally about the role of the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. It needs to be a military advisor to the President of the United States, of course, to provide a personal perspective based on the years of experience that person has acquired to the President, and of course to provide options for how to actually accomplish what the President wants to do. But it doesn't surprise me whatsoever that the General Kane did not provide any personal perspective about being opposed to this operation. He was brought out of retirement by orders of the President. The President invited him back into the military in order to serve this role, and I don't know the nature of their relationship. But if the President handpicks you to replace C.Q. Brown, the chairman before him, the President found to be too woke, I can only imagine that there are other motivating factors that might cloud the chairman's advice to the President.
Yeah, and I still don't think we know what those factors are. I was following it when he was nominated, and it didn't actually sound like Trumpers people knew the guy that well. They had an inkling that he would be on their side, but I've never seen any really reporting or anything else about what went into that and what that might have been. So it's interesting. You raise a really good point there. Dan, I want to go to something you said earlier about not following orders. And this is something that many of our listeners are probably not familiar with. Soldiers follow orders, except legally, soldiers do not have to follow illegal orders. And we had a number of members of Congress a few months ago who were former members of the military, and they had given advice to soldiers and reminded soldiers they don't need to legally follow orders. But I also know, having many friends in the military and some knowledge of it, that that's a really hard thing to do. And it is incredibly hard when someone above you, starting at the commander-in-chief and the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of the War now as he likes to be called, when those people give orders, it is insanely hard to say that is illegal. What's the reality of that? I don't know if you've given that advice to anyone in the past about illegal orders, or if you've had to say something about it. What are we looking at in terms of what soldiers, both at the highest levels and then at lower levels, go through personally when something like that is happening?
Absolutely. The comments that were made and the video that was put out last fall by the sitting members of Congress, including Mark Kelly, that shouldn't have been controversial. What they said was spot on, was fully legal, and really not surprising given training that every person in the military receives during their introductory training.
Let me interfere for just 1 second. Didn't they basically quote a military manual on what to do when they put that letter out?
Yes, of course. Every person who joins the military knows, whether you're enlisted or an officer, based on your oath, that you obey legal orders, and they're there to support and defend the Constitution. Now, as you said, in practice, that can be extremely challenging when the whole force and the inertia of an institution are geared around efficiency and not allowing time to think and ponder, and not really allowing any space at all to ponder the legality of orders. The orders are simply assumed, or presumed, I should say, to be legal. And yet that's where the responsibility of officers, and especially lawyers, the JAG officers, come in, where the role of a judge advocate is to advise. There's, of course, military justice side of things and administrative law side of things, but the primary role of judge advocates is to advise commanders on operations, which translates to advise commanders on whether the orders, how to actually execute on orders in a lawful way. So orders come down, the commanders have a different array of options before them. The judge advocate is there to advise what are the legal constraints that shape their options. And so what it actually means in practice is that the officer corps of whatever military branch would be involved in executing an operation would have to actually think more deeply about what they're actually doing. And there's some gray space, such as when we saw the president deploy active duty troops to the streets of Los Angeles last year. I wrote an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune highlighting that we really needed those officers to be careful about every single order that comes through,
yep,
to make sure that what they're doing was actually to protect not only the officer corps, but more importantly, to protect the troops that are under their command. But when it comes to something like the president saying that an entire civilization will die tonight, that should trigger that doesn't really require too detailed of an analysis. That should trigger the alarm bells in every member of the military, and I would like to think that those who would be carrying out the orders would stop, even if the leaders who are handpicked at the top are more inclined to pursue whatever the president says, no matter what the legality.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to clarify one thing that you're saying. So it is interesting to me. It's not a matter of just black and white, you disobey an order, but your first responsibility is to do your best to fulfill the order in a legal way before you would actively disagree something. Is that correct?
That's right. So long as what you're being told, there's a legal way to do it, the expectation would be that you find a way to do it legally. But there is no legal way to kill an entire civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. This actually, you literally just brought something to mind from Trump's first administration, where there were some questions at various points of, was the military putting some practices in place, and to question the deployment of nuclear weapons and the president not being able to do that. And when Mark Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, there was the feeling that that was happening at some level. This happened under Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon was going downhill. But I can't help but wonder now, I don't think there's any way for us to know, I can't help but wonder if there are some people at the top of the military who have to be really actively thinking about whether they're going to follow an order to launch a nuclear weapon.
I think after today, or after this week, we don't have to wonder. We can assume that there are people involved in those conversations right now that have to be the last ditch protection of the Constitution and of the United States against what would be a genocide if pursued.
Yeah, absolutely horrific. Dan, Tully, excellent conversation. I love this stuff. I could have gone on with you for another couple hours on this, but unfortunately our time's up. Thank you very much for joining us. Dan Tully was a candidate for Congress in the 8th District, and I wish you the very best now that election is over, and good luck in the future.
Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid, on WCPT 820.
Don't forget, folks, Monday on Live, Local, and Progressive, Joan Esposito will be joined by Emanuel Chris Welsh, the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives, also Illinois Congressman Eric Sorensen, and Ed Yonka, Director of Communications and Public Policy at the ACLU Illinois. That's Live, Local, and Progressive, weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. Central on WCPT, 820 a.m., heartlandsignal.com, and tune in. Now I'd like to welcome my next guest in a slightly different subject. Peter Shane is an American legal scholar and author. He's the Jacob B. Davis and Jacob B. Davis II Chair in Law Emeritus at Ohio State University and a Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the New York University School of Law. He's also the author of Democracy's Chief Executive, Interpreting the Constitution and Defining the Future of the Presidency. And he's the host of Democracy's Chief Executive, the podcast. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. And I'm looking forward to a half hour on the Constitution and the presidency. And strangely enough, these aren't just American politics courses now or law courses. Everybody's actually concerned about this.
This is true. This is a gift I would rather have not received, but the current president's been great for law school enrollment.
Yep. May we live in interesting times. I find myself saying that too often lately.
Yeah.
So, Peter, get us started here. I'm going to start with the big picture question. Is the separation of powers in the United States dead? And if not, how do we get it back?
It's not dead, but the separation of powers was designed to accomplish something in particular, which was a system of checks and balances that would operate to try to prevent the arbitrary exercise of power and try to ensure the fair administration of justice. We still have a formal separation of powers, to be sure, and you will see courts overturn things that the executive branch is doing. Sometimes you will see the executive branch, I guess, sometimes vetoing what Congress asks it to do. Congress sometimes will decline to appropriate money for things. But that system of checks and balances is really out of whack. And even though you can see some checking going on, you think about the tariff case, for example, that the Supreme Court decided. What we're seeing much more of is the way in which the Roberts Court, through its executive power indulgent rhetoric, has significantly enabled the kind of presidency that Trump is running, and a truly supine Congress, which is not standing up for its own prerogatives or authorities under Article 1, but allowing partisanship to completely overcome its kind of protectiveness towards its own authorities.
Peter, let's go to a specific example here, and then we can get more general again. I'm thinking about the War Powers Act, because this has just come up in the last couple of weeks with Iran, and this is something that arguably has been eroding almost since the end of World War II, but certainly since the 1970s. It looks like Congress has just given up any interest in taking responsibility for declaring war, and politically it's just not a thing anymore. What do you think about that? Where are we at, and can we expect that to ever be used again?
The war powers example is interesting because, if I may put it this way, it is the most thoroughly bipartisan example of how checks and balances has eroded. In domestic affairs, the story is not really symmetrical between Democrats and Republicans, but when it comes to war powers, presidents of both parties have played a significant role. And I suppose it should also be said that it's not just a matter of executive usurpation, but also another example of Congress all too willingly turning over too much authority to the executive branch. What has happened, and I suppose, just to back up one sentence here, in order for the executive branch to deploy military force with legal authority, it's not necessary that Congress formally declare war. Congress can authorize the use of force through ordinary statutes. And in fact, there's just a handful of kind of military episodes in our history that have commenced for the U.S. with a formal declaration of war. It is much more typical that the authority come through statutes, and certainly, what happened after 9/11, what happened with regard to Iraq, happened pursuant to statutes that were called authorizations to use military force.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, having said that, Congress has not recently enacted any statutes that authorize military force against particular targets. There was certainly nothing that authorized the use of military force against Iran. And with regard to, anti-terrorist activities in which the military has been deployed around the globe, we're still relying on, the executive branch is still relying on the authority to use military force against those who aided and abetted Al Qaeda in 2001. And of course, we're fighting people who were not even born in 2001. And then the Iraq resolution as well. And the executive branch over the years, and notwithstanding the War Powers Resolution, which we could talk about, has developed a kind of doctrine with regard to when the president is entitled constitutionally to deploy military force on his or her own. It is very common, particularly in military and foreign affairs contexts, for the Constitution to be interpreted in light of the kind of historic practice and interaction of the branches. There's very little text to go on.
Right.
So when there are patterns of interaction that develop over the decades and indeed over the centuries, those come to be what the branches understand the Constitution to mean. Lawyers talk about this as, the gloss on the Constitution. Congress could take it back. Congress could regulate if it wants to.
Right.
But if it doesn't, these are the informal understandings that prevail.
So you're getting to something that I wanted to ask about real quick. Let me interrupt here. I teach international law. I'm not quite as familiar with the American side of it, but my understanding is, and this is one of those practices that's not written into law, effectively with the War Powers Act, the president has 60 days to act, and then Congress can decide whether that act is legitimate. But if Congress doesn't do anything, the president effectively has an unlimited amount of time. Is that accurate? Is that how it's been interpreted?
Well, with a small asterisk, perhaps.
Sure.
But what you say, reflects, again, what I was also talking about, which is that, the elected branches of government have basically worked out a pattern of interaction that allows presidents to deploy military force until, let's put Iran to one side for a second, in limited circumstances and for a limited period of time. The War Powers Resolution was written in order to say to the president, there are limited circumstances under which Congress recognizes that presidents may deploy force unilaterally, but when that happens, we insist, President, that you report this to us, and then unless we authorize through formal legislation the continued presence of troops in a kind of in military hostilities, you have to bring them home in 60 or 90 days. Now, what the Department of Justice has done in terms of interpreting this history of practice, including the War Powers Resolution, is the Office of Legal Counsel, always referred to as OLC. OLC has basically taken the position that Congress has time and time again, and now through the War Powers Resolution, acquiesced in this idea that the president can do things unilaterally by deploying military force as long as he can basically do them quickly. The sort of underlying theme might be no more Vietnams.
Right.
And the way in which the lawyers talk about this, and you can occasionally, Trump will refer to this rhetoric as well, that there is a certain level of military engagement that is so likely to be sustained, so likely to involve the United States in a kind of extended, dangerous situation, that it amounts to a war that Congress must authorize in advance. But if it falls short of war, according to the Justice Department, the president can proceed unilaterally if he meets two tests. And I'll say them with a straight face, but as soon as I say them, you're going to think to yourself, no sane president could ever fail these tests. So one thing the president has to be able to say is that I'll just keep saying he, although it's he or she,
right,
whoever's president, has identified a significant national interest to be protected by the commitment of U.S. troops into these potential combat situations. Now, there's no president who's going to send troops into hostilities without being able to say out loud some version of what national interest requires them to do so. So That's not a constraint at all.
I will say, though, this one's been interesting because the president has thrown out so many possible reasons and doesn't seem to have one that the administration has settled on. So even on that, they've got they've got a bunch of reasons that would fulfill that qualification, but they certainly haven't come down and said there's just one.
Right. But of course, from the Justice Department's point of view, that's a political problem. That's not the legal problem.
Right.
If the court if the president has one interest that supports what's going on Monday and another interest that supports Tuesday and a third interest that supports Wednesday, that's fine. And the second part, again, is what I mentioned before, that is the conflagration, whatever it is, cannot be so great as to amount to kind of full-fledged war. And Trump, who sort of understands this idea, excuse me, occasionally, at least for a while, was saying, we're at war. Oh, I'm not supposed to say war. We're involved in a military confrontation or something like that, because he thinks that this is, what the lawyers are talking about, this kind of magically putting off the need for congressional authorization.
Yeah, this is probably one of those places where Trump's history helps him too. He regularly says whatever he's doing will be done in 2 weeks, and that would seem to, again, fulfill this.
Yes. Again, one assumes that the test, if it's applied in good faith, requires some, again, good faith basis for anticipating that an interaction will be of limited scope. And going after Iran, certainly raises the question. And the other thing to be said, you mentioned teaching international relations. Of course, there are two systems of law going on here. There's the domestic system of law, but there's also international law.
Right.
And a military engagement can be lawful under international law, but not meet the requirements of the domestic constitution. It may be that what a president does meets the requirements of domestic constitutionality or statutory legality, but still violates international law. And
now let me just clarify this. As a legal expert here, Peter, this is something I just talked about with my last guest, and something that I have focused on personally is international law that we have ratified is domestic law under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. So really, shouldn't we be treating all of these laws as domestic laws? We like to separate, but the Constitution doesn't make a separation, does it?
The Constitution gives to Congress the power to determine the degree to which international law should be treated as domestic law. So when we're a signatory to the United Nations Treaty, that binds us to certain international obligations. But whether any treaty we sign can be enforced as a matter of domestic law is up to Congress. And according to the Supreme Court, the presumption is that treaties are not self-executing. That is, unless Congress has taken legislative steps to make international law enforceable in U.S. courts, then it does operate separately.
It's a good point.
It's an interesting question, of course. The president is required to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Should that not include international law? But ordinarily, the systems are treated as being analytically separate.
It's a good point. I know that's one of the things that international organizations sometimes criticize us for, is that we don't write our international agreements into domestic law. So that's absolutely a factor that's out there. Peter, let me take you back to something you said earlier. Let's get back to the big picture a little bit. You mentioned the importance of the Roberts Court and its view of the presidency and how that has kind of led to an assault on checks and balances. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Maybe put some specifics on it too.
Sure. So I often talk about the Roberts Court as having created a particular narrative of the constitutional presidency that posits three kind of main ideas, each of which is problematic in its own right. One is the proposition, and again, I'm trying to state these fairly without smirking, but
Sure.
these are really dubious propositions.
The good news is we're on the radio, so unless you admit you're smirking, we can't tell that you're smirking.
So you can't tell if I'm smirking. I'm told some people listening to me know what I'm.
I've had that problem too.
Right. Okay. So in any event, the first proposition is that the president, and again, and I'm repeating the very specific rhetoric of the Roberts Court, is a one-person branch of government, that the president alone possesses all of the executive power that Article 2, vests in anyone in the Constitution, and therefore, you know, well, if you take the extreme form of what's called unitary executive theory, that means that the president could undertake anything that the executive branch is authorized to do by the Constitution or by statute, and do it himself if he felt like it. He could say EPA regulations. I'm tired of them writing their own regulations. I'll just write them in the White House. And that means that everything that the executive branch does is somehow serving the president rather than serving the law or serving Congress. The second proposition is that what lends legitimacy to the entire operation of the administrative state is what the court again has called an unbreakable chain of command from, the lowliest officers in the United States, civil officers, directly up to the president. And again, this reinforces the idea that the entire executive branch, constitutionally speaking, in the hands of the Roberts Court, is really an instrument of the president's will. And the third proposition, and this is expressed most fully and dangerously in the Trump immunity case in 2024, is that the president enjoys, a large swath of unilateral power that exists beyond the capacity of Congress to regulate, and beyond the power of courts, so says the Roberts Court, to control. And to give you an example, and lawyers always talk about the holding of a case, the things that the court had to say in order to resolve a case, versus the dicta, the stuff that was part of the overall analysis, but
Yep.
The court didn't really have to go into it. So the immunity case is just chock full of dicta. But one of them is that the president's, as the court says, conclusive and preclusive powers that must be left to the president's unchecked, unregulated deployment, are his powers over criminal prosecution and investigation. And this proposition, particularly for a court that purports to be originalist, looking at the Constitution the way that the founding generation would have looked at it, this is just historically preposterous. But having said that, you can see how, and forgive the pun, the Trump administration has embraced this idea with a vengeance, because you can see, despite decades of work to try to reestablish a kind of basically hands-off relationship between the White House and the Justice Department when it comes to individual prosecutions after Watergate. This is the work of both Democratic and Republican attorneys general. The Trump administration just blew that up, right? Yep. They said, the White House can tell the Justice Department who it wants to see prosecuted. And time and again, the Trump administration has gone after people not because they have any probable cause to believe criminal activity has occurred, but because somebody has either crossed Trump in the past, or so that's his perception, or they're not going along with his policy preferences now. So the latest example involves what started as a grand jury investigation involving the way the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System was renovating its office buildings, and the way in which the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell, had testified to Congress about the renovations. Now, some subpoenas were issued as part of that investigation, and Chairman Powell went to the DC District Court and successfully quashed those subpoenas
Right.
on the ground that this was a purely retributive criminal investigation.
Let me stop you, Peter, because I want to take several of the things. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, but you raised some extremely important points. First, I'm pretty sure I did hear you smirk when you talked about vengeance and the idea that this is a vengeance issue, which I think almost everybody sees. A couple of things. The idea that there is something that the president can do, anything that is beyond the power of the courts to check, is kind of amazing to me. Did they have some legal rationale for that, or is that just almost a political statement for all intents and purposes?
The Supreme Court, really from the beginning, has taken the position that there are some powers that the Constitution gives to the president that are beyond judicial review, but they're pretty narrow. So, for example, if I've been duly incarcerated pursuant to a legitimate criminal conviction, and my cellmate gets a presidential pardon, and I do not, even though I have a better record of behavior, I'm less likely to be a recidivist. I'm a more upstanding,
Right.
Model prisoner. I can't go to court on the ground that the president giving my cellmate a pardon and not me was arbitrary.
And it makes sense.
That's just beyond judicial review. The other thing to be said is that there's some things that go beyond judicial review because it's very hard to find somebody who can claim a personal injury that gives them what the courts call standing,
Right.
to challenge it. And I just offer this because it's a perfect example. Trump has now, the Department of the Treasury has proposed a design for a commemorative coin for the 250th anniversary of the country that would have Donald Trump on the front of the coin. And what they're taking advantage of, or hoping to take advantage of, is that the law that covers this particular kind of commemorative coin only prohibits portraits of living people on the reverse side of the coin.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. You hear me smirking again?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's imagine that this is perhaps unlawful. It's hard to identify someone who has been so injured by it that they could go to court and have it enjoined. And a lot of the things that the executive branch does are either too obscure or the harms are just too diffuse. It's too tough to prove that something that looks to the world as if it was just outrageously lawless, nonetheless affected Peter Shane in particular, John Smith in particular,
Right.
in a way that allows them to sue. And inertia, I always say, favors lawlessness.
Let's have. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Let's have one final question here, Peter. And we got about 3 minutes left, 4 minutes left. You mentioned bias in going after people, and that's something that's been very central to this Trump administration. And he's been clear about it. He doesn't make any lies about it or doesn't try to hide it at all. He's just biased in pushing people. Donald Trump cannot be found guilty of that bias. A question that I've had, though, is, are some of the people who take the roles of putting that bias into effect, whether it is someone high up in the Justice Department, whether it's on an immigration issue in ICE or something like that, when the president's bias comes in, the president is immune. Are there other people down the line, though, who might not be immune and who might be subject to some legal issues later, probably after Trump is out of office? So is there legal risk for some of the people who implement these policies?
There is risk. The president's subordinates do not enjoy the same scope of immunity, either civil or criminal. Well, the Supreme Court has decided they don't have the same level of civil immunity. One supposes they wouldn't have the same level of criminal immunity. But the risk might be more on the civil side than the criminal side. And the reason I say that is because the president, I think he may have already addressed this, I'm not sure, but the president could, on his last day in office, issue a blanket pardon to anyone who had worked for him, to immunize them from criminal prosecution for any of their official acts taken during his administration. Interestingly, the pardon power doesn't extend to civil liability.
Yep.
So to the extent people are committing constitutional torts that might give rise to damages remedies, they would remain at risk.
Yeah, and in the case of false prosecution, or in the case of some of the things that ICE is doing against individuals, that's a very real possibility. I think that's extremely important. So thank you. That's very good. Final thoughts? Is this going to get fixed? Is this breaking the entire system?
I think it is fixable, but it's going to require a different kind of political context than the one in which we now find ourselves. I think, when you have the government, for whatever its faults, was operating with a certain kind of equilibrium in the system of checks and balances, at least in domestic affairs, from World War II till 2016. They're not perfectly, but you didn't have to go to bed each night worried about it.
Right.
And that equilibrium is now fallen apart. And when you have a relationship or a set of institutional relationships where they go out of equilibrium, the only way of getting them back into equilibrium is through some external shock. And whether that shock is going to come from a massive, prolonged, democratic victory that kind of routs the MAGA movement out of government, or from a yet more resurgent right-wing kind of nationalist movement that entrenches itself. There's a possibility that the government can change, but it's going to require a lot of popular involvement to make that happen.
Peter Shane, thank you very much. And we could easily spend another, 5 days talking about this, but I really appreciate your perspective. I want to remind everybody, Peter Shane's an American legal scholar and author. He is the author of Democracy's Chief Executive, Interpreting the Constitution and Defining the Future of the Presidency. And if you want to hear more, he's got Democracy's Chief Executive, the podcast. Peter, thank you.
It's been great to talk with you.
From the heart of Chicago, it's WCPT 820. Progressive Talk Radio, where facts matter and voices fight for change. WCPT 820.
NBC News Radio, I'm Lisa Carton. Vice President J.D. Vance is leading the U.S. delegation for peace talks with Iran. Vance said he expects today's discussion in Islamabad will be positive. Pakistani mediators are facilitating the negotiations. The talks come just days after President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire with the condition that Tehran reopen the Strait of Hormuz. In an early morning post on Truth Social, Trump said the U.S. is clearing the key oil shipping channel, quote, as a favor to the world. Calls are growing for Congressman Eric Swalwell to drop out of the California governor's race after a new report alleges sexual misconduct, including allegations of rape. More from Jason Nathanson.
Swalwell defended himself in a social media post Friday night.
They did not happen. They have never happened. And I will fight them with everything that I have.
One unnamed former staffer told CNN that Swalwell forced himself on her while she was almost blackout drunk 2 different times, once as recently as 2 years ago. Others claim he made unwanted advances.
Eric Swalwell must withdraw from the governor's race and immediately resign from Congress.
Former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa is running against Swalwell for governor. Governor Gavin Newsom calls the allegations deeply troubling.
The Vatican is backing up the Pentagon following reports of a meeting that turned heated. The Free Press reported that during a meeting with Cardinal Christophe Pierre on January 22nd, the Pentagon's Policy Office Chief Elbridge Colby warned the U.S. military has, quote, the power to do whatever it wants and that the church had better take its side. The Pentagon pushed back against the report, saying the meeting between the two and Pierre's team was substantive, respectful, and professional. Tyga is set to make his feature film debut. The Grammy-nominated rapper is set to star in the coming-of-age drama Baby You're a Star. The film will follow an aspiring music artist determined to overcome life's obstacles to reach stardom. And you're listening to the latest on NBC News Radio.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter. Because facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Don't forget to tune in again on Monday to Driving It Home on WCTP. Patty Vasquez will talk to Illinois Congresswoman Robin Kelly and Kelly Barr, the Democratic candidate for Congress in Michigan's 1st District. Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez is weekdays from 5 to 7 p.m. Central on WCPT 820 AM, the Heartland Signal website, TuneIn, YouTube, and Facebook. My last guest for the day is Susan Cork. Susan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. Susan is the Executive Director of Democracy Defenders Action, a bipartisan team fighting autocracy and protecting the Constitution, safeguarding American democracy. She's been in senior pro-democracy leadership roles at the Southern Poverty Law Center, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Freedom House, Human Rights First, and the U.S. State Department. Impressive and exactly the kind of person we need to talk to these days. How's everything going for you?
Going well overall. It's a beautiful day here in Maryland. So, on the other hand, we're talking about some serious trends here today. So,
It's true. So, sometimes I'm accused of being cynical and bringing things down. So I just had to brighten it up for a minute there. Now let's bring it back down again, or hopefully you can give us a little bit of help. My question for you, the big picture is, do we still have a democracy? One of the things I've noticed is international groups that measure democracy downgraded us over the past few weeks. How important is that, and what does it mean for life in the U.S.?
We certainly do have a democracy. I mean, one of the things that I think is something to feel optimistic about is that we do have a democracy. It has been degraded deliberately by the president himself and those surrounding him. But we do have a vibrant democracy. And, I used to work at Freedom House, too, so I'm very familiar with its measurement of freedom and democracy in particular. And one thing I did notice there, it's interesting that I've been working in the field of protecting and advancing democracy for, a quarter of a century now, and which started with kind of the rise and kind of a lot of optimism around democracy and other countries really looking to the U.S. For inspiration as, a leader in democracy and a supporter of democracy. And then we saw the rise of authoritarianism, and the erosion of democracy was a trend for many years. And, as those trends continued, my career shifted westward. That I initially was working on Russia and Ukraine, and then I was working within the heart of Europe in countries like Hungary and Poland, where democracy was eroding. And then those trends came here to roost in the U.S. So one interesting thing I thought of about those reports is that the U.S. is a bit of an outlier right now, that it is declining in its democratic trends, while other countries, our democracies are either holding steady or, in places like Hungary, we have a really interesting election this weekend where, Hungary may reverse some of its decline and actually oust Viktor Orban, who is, the sort of the prototype of an authoritarian, and, an opposition candidate has a really good chance of winning. So the one optimistic thing I'd say about democracies is it's very dynamic. The people have a lot of power. President Trump and his cronies have done a lot to try to hack away at our democratic system. But by and large, it may have weakened a bit, but we are holding. The people are mobilizing on the streets, and here at Democracy Defenders Action, we are holding Trump and other corrupt officials to account.
Excellent. And actually, let's talk about Viktor Orban in Hungary for a moment. I talked to my first guest on the show about this, and I'd like to get your perspective on it. I teach international relations. One of the most important things I know on democracy is not that you have elections, but that you have elections where one party vacates office and another party that wins the election is allowed to take office. When we talk about Viktor Orban, there is the threat that he might stay in power. And Donald Trump has actually made some similar threats. They've been very veiled, but he's talked about staying beyond the term. Do you know enough about Hungary to say what the likelihood might be there that if Orban loses, something like that might happen?
I don't know how to predict the likelihood. I will say it is the bedrock expectation that an election, that the loser walks away from office and the winner takes office is a bedrock expectation, and the critical litmus test of a democracy. And Hungary is very interesting because Trump, J.D. Vance, and the hard right, which is now the GOP party. It's no longer extreme. It is actually the mainstream Republican Party now, has long really admired Viktor Orban and what he's been able to do in Hungary, where he really centralized power and degraded institutions and the judiciary and weakened rule of law and undermined free media. The corruption spread to him and his inner circle. And, Trump has long really admired that. And J.D. Vance was out there campaigning for Orban, which shows, just how much they care about the outcome of this. Within, kind of my, political circles, there has been discussion about, will he do something dramatic? This is, somebody said, that it certainly looks like Orban is cooked, that all the polls are showing that the opposition candidate is likely to win, which, also goes to show that there's only so much that an authoritarian can do. It's actually pretty hard to rig an election. And I do think if he were to try something dramatic, the fact that so many people have already been mobilizing and going to the streets, and the fact that, the opposition candidate has been able to amass a lot of support, it would be a pretty dangerous situation. And, Trump has, of course, upped the ante, saying that the U.S. Could surge in and, would weigh in economically. So that is certainly a dangerous scenario. Hungary is also part of the EU and NATO. So I hope that there's enough things that are holding it in place. There would be pretty dramatic ramifications for Hungary, including, they're one of the big recipients of EU financial aid. So it would be a pretty kind of dramatic step. They don't have, real military to speak of. So it would be a pretty hard thing to pull off.
Yeah, and I'd say pretty dramatic is probably a bit of an understatement there as far as that goes. You brought up a couple of things that I want to talk about. First, let's go back to the downgrades in U.S. democracy. So I don't know everything that was involved in it, but my understanding is we've been downgraded for activities on January 6th, and that's been happening for a few years. We've been downgraded on threats to elections, things like President Trump suggesting that the Republican Party should count the votes in the states, and then on limitations on voter suppression and gerrymandering and things like that. Are there some other things I'm not mentioning there? But more importantly, how big a concern should these be to us? There are days when it looks pretty bad.
It is quite bad, and it is unprecedented in, since, in the post civil rights era, certainly. In comparing what Trump has done here to what happened in Russia under Putin, under Orban in Hungary, was the speed and the velocity and the not even trying to do it in kind of in a hidden way.
Right.
In Hungary, it was kind of death by a thousand cuts, where or another, I guess, metaphor is the frog boiling in water. That
Right.
things kind of changed slowly, bit by bit, and the public, each thing didn't necessarily cause an outcry or people to notice. It was kind of the cumulative effect of the temperature turning up the temperature that things got a little bit less free, a little bit less free.
Yeah, and
Trump
Trump
has
keeps
been
saying the
so
quiet.
brazen.
Yep, he
Yeah,
keeps saying the quiet things out loud, except they're not the
the
quiet
quiet
things
things
anymore.
out loud, and I mean, and the corruption. Usually too, the scale of corruption is less obvious and dramatic, and I think Orban, that has come to light, and that's one of the things that contributed to the rise of the opposition in Hungary, and is true of many countries where there's an authoritarian leader. Corruption usually goes hand in hand in that, and ultimately that usually does create some sort of tipping point where the public realizes that all of the things that have been done to erode democracy are leading to the resources and their tax money and public goods being corrupted, and it's the point at which they can't, the hospitals aren't as good anymore, and the universities, and
Yeah.
distribution of justice. So it is very dangerous what Trump is doing. This centralization of executive power that he has done here, the blatant attempts to erode the checks and balances and make Congress be complicit, what he has been doing with the weaponization of the courts, and kind of being quite publicly saying he expects the Supreme Court to be complicit, and he really sees that the Department of Justice is his personal arm for retribution, to use the Department of Justice for the politicization of law enforcement, to be using it to go after his perceived enemies, is incredibly dangerous, such a misuse of executive power. It's just, I mean, beyond the pale to be using it to retaliate against critics and law firms and lawyers,
I was just talking about that with our last
universities,
guest.
media.
Yep, just talking about that with our last guest, Peter Shane, in the last half hour. And the fact that with that, too, he's not hiding it in any way, shape, or form. He's just flat out going out and saying that he wants to go after his enemies, and he wants the courts to, he expects the courts to be on his side. That's part of kind of the braggadocio, to use the Trump word for it, that goes with it. Let me take you to a slightly different side,
Absolutely.
Susan. And I know you've thought some about this. The combination of democracy and problems for democracy with someone like Trump, when he focuses so much on self-glorification, he's really a demagogue. He's the kind of autocrat who wants everything focused on the dear leader. But between self-glorification and then just self-enrichment and family enrichment, he's violating a number of U.S. laws that the courts aren't holding him to on these things so far. But how does that all play into the problems for our democracy when we have a leader who is this self-centered?
This self-centered, and I mean, even more negative way of interpreting it is that if you look at most of his moves, the actual reason for it is self-enrichment.
Yeah.
That there, as far as kind of the usual norm of a president acting on the best interests of the country, he is really the conflict of interest between the president's business ventures. The Trump family business has made at least $1.5 billion since he was elected in November 2024. We actually have anti-corruption and oversight and ethics unit at Democracy Defenders Action, and we have been tracking all of this. When he took $400 million from the $400 million jet from the Qatari government, and putting U.S. taxpayers on the hook for at least $1 billion to retrofit it.
Yep.
And he plans to take the plane with him to the presidential library. We have been exposing him, holding him accountable.
But this week,
Similarly,
by the way, I think the Qataris said they want it back now after what's happening in Iran and the fact that they're getting hit and their oil fields are getting hit. So that's another
yeah, I
interesting
mean, I think
side.
the consequences. The other thing that's true of Trump is he doesn't think about the potential consequences. He just does what he wants in the moment without thinking it through. Our policy, our anti-corruption and oversight and ethics team too has been tracking his many conflicts of interest, particularly in the crypto sphere, um, and with his meme coins. Just the grift and the scale of it is something I never thought we would see in this country.
Yeah, it's incredible. Can you give us a website for that, by the way? I'd love to take a look at that myself. I'm sure the listeners would
Sure.
too.
It is our sister organization, Democracy Defenders Fund. So it's www.democracydefendersfund.org/crypto. And we have a crypto tracker tool on there, which enables you to kind of see exactly what's going on, as well as several kind of deep dives showing how the Trump family in particular has been enriching themselves.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond, I mean, I think the enriching is the core problem. Like I was talking earlier about the question of who benefits. It's sadly incredibly clear with Trump, but it's also just his narcissism and his ego. So it's things like the ballroom and the federal building banners that I'm not sure he directly benefits from. What kind of impact do those have inside the government and for the country?
I mean, both. I mean, this is something that the public can clearly understand and is really contributing to like the No Kings movement, that people are coming out in greater and greater numbers. Just the recent one a few weeks ago had almost 8 million people, at least 8 million people come out, which, represents a significant increase. And it's because people are angry. His popularity is very low and declining. People are connecting things. I have a 11-year-old daughter. She was 10 at the time. And her takeaway was he's refusing, food stamps to people while he's building a ballroom. That's disgusting. So even at a fifth grader can understand that that is just deeply wrong, that he is taking money from the money we pay in taxes that should be going to help people have enough to eat, and instead he is using taxpayer money on this atrocious ballroom effort. Just the hypocrisy, and the fact that this is the opposite of what he campaigned against is apparent to the public, and it is driving significant discontent.
He has way too many similarities to Louis XIV. That's something I think about not infrequently in terms of where we are versus the French Revolution and,
history
the inequality.
Repeats.
No, absolutely.
I mean, these are not new tricks that he's inventing. He is maybe more brazen about it, less constrained by rules or norms or values, but he is using classic authoritarian playbook. And, corruption is a core feature, not a bug of being an authoritarian. He's renaming the Institute of Peace Building for himself.
Right.
He started an unauthorized war, deployed militarized ICE agents in the U.S.
Yep. 2 wars, Venezuela and Iran. So
demonstrably made this country and the world less peaceful.
Yep.
And he's putting his name on the Institute of Peace. I mean, that would be funny if it were not so scary. Similarly, on the Kennedy Center, he's literally carving his name on top of other people's legacies.
I know I have a few friends who are looking forward to the day he loses an election and he goes out of office, and they think the Kennedys may just all come over as a family and take his name off.
Oh, absolutely.
Very
I mean, that will be the first of it. He knows that once he is out of office, the reckoning, and his inner circle knows that too. There will be a reckoning and a holding to account. That much I can promise you we will be doing at Democracy Defenders Action, and with all of our partners and allies and the coalitions that we are part of, that we are ready for the accountability phase.
Absolutely. Let me take us in a slightly different direction. You just made me think about this, and I'm not sure how much background you have in it. A lot of this to me comes back to Project 2025, and it's something that I read before Trump was in office and have skimmed through it in different pieces again. And a lot of what they want, they have listed many of these things. These aren't things that are original to Trump. They're the ones who did a lot of the research, and he has several Project 2025 people in his cabinet and in his advisors. But what they really want is small government, so it can't bother the people who are making all the money at the top. And then a way to get small government is to handicap our democracy and to get less people voting, because less people voting will usually mean better results for the conservative movements that they have set up and they favor. Does your organization talk about that much? Do you work with the problems Project 2025 is causing and has caused?
I mean, certainly we were ready for that. I mean, we understood, despite his disavowal, that this was the blueprint that they were putting out there. And it's because it wasn't new. I mean, these are, on the kind of extreme right, they have been working for years. These are old ideas that of white supremacy and Christian nationalism, which is something that isn't talked about enough. But what Pete Hegseth is doing with the quote unquote Department of War, that it's in the name of Christian nationalism. These are ideas that have been around for a while. So having them put on paper all of the scariest, grossest ideas there, we knew that was real. And so we spent the year before the election getting ready for that. That's why we were, from the minute he was inaugurated, we were ready with our first set of lawsuits. We were ready right out of the gate, knowing that he would challenge birthright citizenship, knowing that he was going to go after. We didn't know how he would do it with Doge, but we did know that he was going to gut the civil service,
right,
and put loyalists in place. So we were ready with lawsuit after lawsuit. We've been involved in close to 300 cases and matters at this point, both alone, with partners, in coalition, with Republicans, with Democrats. We anticipated many of the moves that he was going to make. And, I think one of the things we can feel really good about and proud that we, democracy defenders, I really think that we had a key role in sending Musk away and making sure that what they tried to do with Doge was not successful.
That's
and we've
excellent.
been winning case after case, helping USAID or Voice of America employees get their jobs and their benefits back, helping protect data. So we've been case after case, Lisa Cook, really kind of fighting to make sure that those people, the civil servants who are the backbone of our government and our democracy, have people fighting for them and winning in court. So as much as Trump tried to do, we have seriously handicapped and destroyed many of his autocratic ambitions.
Yeah, and that's incredibly important and wonderful to hear. And thank you to you and the organization for being in the middle of that. My one concern on that is that, again, this was always part of the plan. They do something and they throw it out there and they fire a lot of people, and then the people eventually win the lawsuits, but that eventually is months or years later, and people have left to go to different places, and it still undermines the government. But at the same time, it is insanely important to show that, yes, this stuff was illegal and that, we have to remedy it and it's not allowed in the future. So that's important to look forward. Susan, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes here. I want to turn to a positive that you brought up, and actually 2 positives. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what you might have as hopes for the No Kings movement or similar things? I love to see Americans organizing and getting out there in the streets and actively working for those things. We've seen some past movements that haven't always worked through to a conclusion, but I'm kind of hopeful for No Kings. I want to see if you are too. And then maybe you can talk a little bit more about just some of these lawsuits. Are there 1 or 2 incredibly important lawsuits that you've had that you really think are going to help democracy in the future?
Sure. Yes, so I will say the No Kings movement, and we actually we're kind of closely in touch with them, and it has been very well organized. One of the, having studied democracies around the world, one of the key signs of success is that you have a diverse and widespread movement, where the having no kings as a unifying slogan, everybody understands that it is core to American identity. It is core to what Americans believe, and they understand that the corruption and the unaccountable behavior of Trump and are unified against it. Another thing that's, I think, was a really good, thoughtful way of organizing, that it's not just based on the capital cities and Washington, D.C. and New York. That each time, and it's grown substantially, but it was in over 3,000 locations around the country.
And I love seeing it
Small
grow in
towns.
some of the
I'm in Frederick,
yeah.
Maryland. There was like 5 blocks of people marching through the streets, so in all of these small cities and towns, the fact that people are coming out, and and it was much more, actually, I'd say much more diverse, both in terms of ages and kind of races and even politics, the most recent one. So that's another sign that, as it becomes more widespread and diverse, that it keeps growing, that's really a bright spot, I think, that we will see continuing throughout the year.
Absolutely. And I very much want to agree with you there, because diversity was not just racial diversity and ethnic diversity and gender diversity. It was red-blue diversity. It's red states and the small towns that were getting some people to turn out, maybe not as much as others. But the fact that anyone in those towns is turning out publicly, I would suggest, is a very good sign for democracy, too.
Mm-hmm. And just to end on, a very recent, really important case. I mean, birthright citizenship is who we are as America. That is what. Sorry, there was a lot of noise there.
No problem.
Just made it quiet for a second. Birthright citizenship is fundamental to who we are as Americans. That differentiates us, and that is something that everybody in this country cares about. It is why most of us are here. And we were so proud to be part of the case that just recently, on April 1st, was heard by the Supreme Court, Trump v. Barbara, a landmark challenge to a second-term Trump executive order, which attempted to end birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants.
Yep.
Our founder, Norm Eisen, represented Democracy Defenders Fund and was one of the co-counsels with ACLU, and successfully argued that the 14th Amendment and the long-standing Supreme Court precedent guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. The SCOTUS reaction and vote was incredibly heartening.
Yeah.
That I think was a good sign of Trump. That was one of the first things out of the gate. It was clearly signaled he would go after that, and that it was upheld in the Supreme Court is, a note of really positive. But I end on that too, because It's positive because it's about people's lives, the people's lives that are impacted and protected by that, the babies and the families. That is just
fantastic.
The one I think our org feels really proud about.
Fantastic work on that, Susan. Thank you very much. Susan Cork is the Executive Director of Democracy Defenders Action. And please, you and the organization, keep up the excellent work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Welcome back, folks. We're going to take some calls in just a minute, 773-763-9278 or 763-WCPT for anybody who still dials by the letters out there. Want to remind everyone, too, that Edwin has a podcast. It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath podcast, and actually there's two of them. One is it's the Democracy Stupid full episodes, and another one is featured interviews. You can subscribe to one or both. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Amazon, and TuneIn. You can just search for It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath, or get the links by visiting heartlandsignal.com/podcasts. That's heartlandsignal, all one word, .com/podcast. We've got a few callers coming in already, and please, anyone else, welcome to join the queue here. Let's start off by going to Jim from Chicago. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Professor. My first vote was for George McGovern, and I never heard left or right in my life. But I know that it originated in the French Revolution, the last decade of the 18th century. That's where they coined that phrase, left and right. If you were right, you were for Louis XVI because of privilege and whatever patronage you could get. If you were left, you were really out in the cold, and you were like, the heck with them. And then anybody else thought, well, this isn't fair. Well, Europe went along with that for another 150 years until they get to 1917 in Russia, and the Soviet pops up in 1917, and I don't know when they coined the word communism, but somewhere after that revolution they coined the word, and they exported it to apparently down to China and to a couple other countries. But the point is they seem to be happy with it. I have no problem with it. But these terms that we use in American politics bother me greatly because we never had a monarch, so we've never experienced that. So I know that the Whigs and the Democrats hated each other in the 1830s, 40s, etc. But you've never heard left or right or any of this insanity. But the point is, but the reason I called today is because everybody's questioning the sanity of Trump. Is he sane or isn't he sane? And he's building a European archway in front of the Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know if you've seen it, but he walks around. Yeah, but he walks around with this drawing like he's lost his mind completely. And everybody, you've seen everybody coming out, the 25th Amendment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But wasn't Reagan? Now, Reagan was off his nut for a couple of years in the White House. He seemed to get away with it. And I know Wilson had a stroke, and they got away with that. But this one is particularly nuts because this war is so crazy. And Vance, yeah, go ahead.
It is, Jim. No problem. You brought up a couple of great things. First, by the way, communism comes from France in the 1840s, and it was a term that went around Europe for quite a while before the Russian Revolution. I want to very much agree with you on a couple of things that you've got here. The first is terms, and this is something political terms have been driving me crazy, and I've been thinking about them a ton the past year or so. The idea of left and right, and the idea of democracy and capitalism and communism. And personally, I've realized a couple of things. The first one is that we don't define them. We just throw them out there and expect people to follow us and expect people to agree with us. And I study communism, socialism, and capitalism. I don't know anyone who can define those terms. And if you put a bunch of academics in the room, they'd probably define them in different ways. But what I've come to realize is they're much more political than anything else. People use them to make political points. And we're not really talking about the facts anymore or the theories. They're just used to separate us and to put us into political categories. So I think that's...
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the point is, when do we get beyond it? You'd think that in the 21st century, that at some point we get beyond that. And, he wants to put, $1 trillion into the military budget. That's another, conservative is another term for, it's synonymous for militarism.
Oh, yeah.
And he wants to throw that in there. And think about this. I mean, economics 101 is guns and butter. I recall that from school. And He's basically they're going all guns and no butter because he said he's going to take it out of the height of, medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he wants to build a dome.
Yep.
And he wants to, where are we headed with this? What about diplomacy, Professor? What about getting ahead of this stuff? And we don't want a war. We don't want people killed. We got to be more advanced than that. Anyway, you're a great show today.
Thank you. Appreciate
it. Taking my call.
Thank you for calling in, Jim. I just really quickly want to address, because you've got great points there. Diplomacy is an example. The Trump administration doesn't seem to have any interest in diplomacy, or at least not any further than self-serving interest in what would be good for the president and arguably what would be good for lining their pockets. But I think you're absolutely right about the insanity. I think it's $1.5 trillion, not $1 trillion for the defense budget. And this is all military-industrial complex. This is the thing Eisenhower warned us about in the 50s, and it is massively coming through now, because that $1.5 trillion is a direct subsidy to U.S. military contractors. So it all goes around. Let's go to Dave from Hoffman Estates. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hey, Professor. A couple things on that with the Iran deal. Militarily, we weakened Iran by taking out all those numerous missile sites and all of this stuff and bombings and maybe 2/3 of its leaders. But like in Vietnam, we had the edge on them too with the bombings and the weaponry and everything. And but we like the veterans would always say, we won all the battles, but history records it as that's the first war we lost. And Iran, just like Vietnam, they're fighting for their homeland,
Exactly.
That we're invaders, basically, and that. And right now, if you went by it, we're losing in Iran, and I'm, we're afraid, after this 2 weeks, I got a feeling he's going to break it before 2 weeks, that he's been taking all of that taco stuff, and he's, he does not like to lose. And I got a feeling, he'll unleash it, and he's, I don't know. And even if they cleared out the Strait of Hormuz right now, tomorrow, with the mines and stuff, and they settle it, it'd be another 6, 9, 12 months before we even see any relief, or recover from this.
No, all your points are excellent, Dave. Thank you. In terms of leaving, by the way, completely agree with the Vietnam analogy. What we're looking at is, I think the best case scenario here personally is that we're going to declare victory and leave at some point in time. And declaring victory and leaving is pretty much always a loss when you do it that way. But the sad part is, you talked about hitting the missile sites and decapitating the leadership. That's about all we were ever going to be able to do. And any expert on Iran was telling us, it's not that they would tell you that, it's that they were telling us that. And, Netanyahu's been trying to get us to go to war with Iran since 92 was the first time. Trump's just the first president that he's actually talked into it. So it's kind of amazing. Straits of Hormuz, predictable, yet nobody thought, Trump didn't think it was going to happen, so his advisors didn't push him on it. So yeah, your points are all excellent and I think correct here.
Yeah, and last thing, Professor, on about this Representative Eric Swalwell controversy. Timing's everything, eh? Kind of like Kerry Swift voting here. And
oh yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just say that. And as we know, the Democratic Party, we're usually good with a circular firing squad, and the knives are out already. They want him out, but and he, guilty before finding innocence. But yet, look at the back at some of the cases, like with Senator Al Franken,
right? Yeah,
and Anthony Weiner, and people that were fighters for us, and they didn't go down with any fight, really.
Yeah.
But yet we got this man sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania right now who's allegedly raped a 13-year-old now they coming out with, and 19 women claim he sexually harassed them and paid off strippers and had sex with a porn star when his final wife here was delivering the baby pretty much, and just difference. So the Democrats, we stepped out with a much of a fight where the Republicans circle the wagons and fight, and then they demand apologies at the end.
Yeah, it's a difference between the parties, Dave. You're absolutely right. First, I just want to lay out there, sexual harassment and sexual assault are insanely serious crimes and insanely serious allegations. And we, frankly, have to take them a lot more seriously than we do. The law doesn't do anywhere near as much as I think we could on it. But you are also correct that the Democrats form circular firing squads. And let's get away from the sexual harassment for a moment, but even just purity tests. If you're not pure enough as a progressive, if you disagree with one thing that another person thinks is progressive, the firing squad tends to come around. And that is not just can be self-defeating, that's been a big problem for the Democrats in the last couple of elections, where you're also right. I mean, I and you might say the Republicans are immoral and doing illegal things, but they care more about winning. And I'm not sure what the balance is there, but if the Democrats want to be able to do some of the things that they claim they want to do, they really do need to figure out how to put differences aside. And I think that might be a key lesson here. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah. Well, listen, let me clear out. Thanks, Professor. Be well.
Appreciate it. Let's go to Pale in Seattle, calling all the way from Seattle. What can I do for you? How are you today?
Oh, fine. Thanks, Professor Brian. Well, I want to return to your opening remarks. So if you have I want to get some quotes, so if you can grab that paper.
Sure.
So the first one I was talking about was it had to do with well, we allow tyranny. We allow the well-to-do to wreak tyranny on those of us who are less fortunate. What was that quote? Because I wanted to.
Yeah, that was the Bertrand Russell quote, and I don't want to misquote it. Actually, I'll see if I can get the exact thing here. But that is basically it in the way you put it, that this is our new definition of freedom. And this is a thing where we never looked at it this way before. It was advocates of capitalism are very apt to appeal to the sacred principles of liberty, which are embodied in one maxim: the most fortunate must not be restrained in the exercise of tyranny over the unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you, because that I was. It's almost a direct paraphrase. One, I don't know which one came first, from what the court wrote in Buckley versus Vallejo, was the concept that government should restrict the speech of some to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment, which, I'm sorry, but money is not speech. And the court does recognize in that case that money is a vehicle to speech. So it's convenient to say, oh, they're the same thing. And basically, so if you don't have any money, well, I'm sorry, but, we can't restrict those who do have vehicles just because you don't. But think of it this way: if we're all familiar, if you go to the community, the community meeting or the city council meeting, there's a microphone, and if you are recognized to speak, you can come up, or they'll bring it to you. But I can't just bring a bullhorn with me and say, well, I disagree with what Mr. Professor Brian said. Yep. Because, wait, you're restricting my relative speech. You can't do that. That's because that would be easy for everybody to do. So they want to restrict, you can't restrict what some people have, which is a lot of money. We can't restrict that. But it's a complete duplicitous to say that money is speech. It's just because the Constitution certainly clearly says that Congress can regulate money, but not as a vehicle to speak.
Yeah, no.
It's BS.
Absolutely.
So then the other quote that I wanted to go back to was, you quoted something from Orwell's 1984. And I make my long point here is that George Orwell, he published the book in 1949, obviously didn't live much more than a year. He never saw how it all manifested. But let's look at it this way. We often think of George Orwell as being prophetic. No, he was an author. He wrote what he knew about and what he saw, which tells us that what he was writing about was already taking place.
Oh, yeah.
Certainly, when you think about your first guest, Katie was talking about she studied the rise of the right wing for years and years and years. And, of course, we have Rachel Maddow and her prequel, book and all of that. It talks about the And frankly, we've had the right wing really since they've been working their will since the founding of the country. They just have not been the morbidly rich until the last 40 years, and they haven't really scored a touchdown like they did in 2016 with Donald Trump. And the problem is that we're playing a different team than what had been, the typical, the traditional right-wing, political right-wing. And once the team figures out how to score a touchdown, the next possession, they're going to score again.
Yep.
And so they're a cancer. And whether you know by personal experience or not, or family experience, that once you're a cancer patient, you're always a cancer patient. And that's what the United States has now, a cancer that maybe go into remission from time to time, but we're going to be dealing with these people, certainly till the end of my life.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Excellent comments across the board. A couple of quick responses to it. I think your comments on those quotes were really good. To me, Citizens United and the associated cases that went with Citizens United are really just that stepping stone that took us above and beyond anything we had seen before in terms of giving rights to non-people, or what's often called legal people, corporations. Giving rights to corporations, giving speech rights to corporations, but also more importantly, basically Citizens United set up what I call a system of expensive speech. It is speech where the more money you have, the more speech you get. And I agree with you, that's very much against the First Amendment. It should be against the First Amendment. The Supreme Court disagrees on that. But it is just absolutely horrible for democracy. And I think that's a key thing that we are facing here, and getting money out of politics is certainly one of the biggest things we have to do. So thank you, Paul. Appreciate your comments.
Thanks so much.
Let's go to at least one more here. Steve on the Gold Coast. Hey, Steve.
Yeah. Hello there. Yes, and to expand on that point, we're living in an age in which the public square is owned by corporations. The fact is that whether we like it or not, the place where people are engaging with each other is not the park or the street corner anymore. It's online. And the reality is that a small number of corporations own that space, and they get to decide who gets to be relevant and who doesn't. So it's not just the case that the wealthy control so much of who gets to say anything with regard to being able to buy speech. They get to decide what is and what isn't going to be permitted on these platforms. So that's point one. Point two, I remember it was well over a decade ago seeing Francis Fukuyama at a dinner, and, I just looked at the guy and said, God, how could anyone have been so wrong?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the Cold War ended, and all of us were just going to, adopt the free market philosophy, and liberal democracy was going to reign. The reality is that nationalism, was just going to disappear after thousands of years? Tribalism, religious sectarianism. I mean, it was ridiculous on his face. I was a grad student when his book was published, and I thought it was bizarre that it was being praised to this degree, and it was no wonder then down the road, it didn't work out that way after all. The thing of it is that, that so much of what I see when I talk to people on the right, because I try not to vilify them, I try to listen to them, but at the same time, they will concede quite often that, yes, they know full well that this is not something that is in the same tradition that we're used to in terms of the exercise of democracy in this country. They feel that we're in a war. So, they will tell you that, well, yes, we need voter ID measures because, elections get stolen and millions of people who are not citizens are voting. And despite the fact that you tell them that there's only a handful of cases, in any given election, none of them are defining in terms of overturning an election one way or another. And they will tell you, no, we need these laws because this is what's happening. The other side is cheating, and they're still convinced that Donald Trump won in 2020. So what they do is they frame this as we're doing these horrible things to society. And as you rightly pointed out, we're labeled as socialists, communists, radicals, all of this. I have yet to meet anybody in this country who's in a position of power that was a socialist. And if you actually go to the people who label themselves as communist/socialists in America, you will find that they have a great deal of disdain for both Democratic and Republican.
Oh yeah, Bernie
so
often shows up as kind of a left centrist in the big picture of what a socialist or communist would be. Steve, thank you. The excellent comments. I just want to go through a couple of them and reinforce them. The media is a huge thing, and it's online media to some extent, but print media especially, and the influence of print media online went from hundreds of owners down to 6 owners and probably down to less in the near future. And they are all multi-millionaires and billionaires who are tied in and who look at media as something to help them profit, not just make profit off their newspapers and other sources and TV shows and networks, but to help their bottom line. And that's not a good way in a democracy to have media that gets rid of the fourth estate and makes it just something that is bought and paid for. I also was laughing when you were talking about Francis Fukuyama, by the way. One of the things I learned in grad school is every PhD learns how to criticize and disprove every other PhD. So it's often a big firing circle where people are in it to prove someone else wrong. But when you do that, you try to make a better point and you try to come up with a better explanation of reality. And sadly, I think our reality has moved in some really negative ways if you're looking at democracy and if you're looking at an economy that is good for the people. Finally, I really appreciate your thoughts that you don't try to vilify people on the right. I'm the same way. I put together the Come Together project to focus on that and the fact that, hey, we've got a ton in common. We shouldn't be vilifying each other when we fall prey to propaganda. We should be looking at the things that we have in common and really pushing for that. So, Steve, thank you very much for your call.
Thank you.
Brian, you're going to be our final caller, and if I can hold you to just a minute or so if you have any questions, and then I'll make a quick comment and reply.
Well, my observation is we're in this era, political ditch of Donald Trump, because for decades we've stopped enforcing laws like Sherman Antitrust, employment law, immigration law. And it's like you spent the afternoon talking about the law in various respects of it. But the problem is laws don't get enforced. And if the Democrats think they're just going to waltz back into the White House, I think they're not popular because people don't believe that they're going to enforce the law. Many people want immigration law enforced. We want a sensible, common sense immigration policy, not what the Democrats have done for the last 30 years. That's the whole problem. Nobody enforces the laws. That's my statement.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I actually agree with you on that, and that's a key issue that we've got. Immigration is a great example. We talk about what the laws are. What most people don't realize in immigration is there have been a bunch of studies, and we know how to fix immigration in Texas and along the southern border. The number one thing we need to do is put in more immigration officers and immigration judges to handle the caseload so those people don't overburden the state of Texas. And Congress knows about this and refuses to fund it and refuses to help basically follow the law on these things. The question of prosecutions of past administrations, I'm sure, is going to come up again as we have elections here and if things switch in elections. Do we hold people accountable to the law or not? That is absolutely a big concern for citizens, and I share your concern. I don't know that our current crop of politicians is going to get any better at that mysteriously overnight. So, Brian, thank you very much for your question. I appreciate it.
All right, good job today. Take care.
Thank you. I would like to thank a lot of people here in closing. First, Edwin Eisendraft. And next week at this time, Edwin will be back with a full slate of guests. Tune in from 1 to 4 p.m. on WCPT 820 a.m., heartlandsignal.com, and tune in. And you can follow Heartland Signal on X, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Threads at heartlandsignal1word.com. Be sure to check heartlandsignal.com for daily updates. You also might like to know that they have a brand new free newsletter. Every week, Heartland Signal's head of research, Aaron Kleinman, delivers Radio Free America, which highlights stories that matter in state politics but aren't getting enough attention. You can subscribe today at heartlandsignal.com/newsletters. My thank yous. I want to thank all of our guests first. They were fantastic, and literally I could have talked to any of them for the full 4 hours very easily. And I know I wouldn't have gotten bored. I hope other people would have stuck with us too. I want to thank Paul and Henry for producing. Excellent job. Made it very easy for me, and I appreciate that. And I certainly want to thank all of the callers that came in too, and say thank you to WCTP and Edwin Eisendrath for having me on to sit in for Edwin today. If you're interested in more of the stuff that I do, easy to look me up online, Brian Endless. Two of the things I mentioned, the World Discord podcast I do on a semi-weekly basis with Joel Ostro, talking about Discord in the world and in the United States. We're going to be doing a segment on who benefits in politics over the next few weeks. And then the Come Together Project. I've been putting up daily TikToks and YouTube shorts for a couple of years now, talking about the problems in the country and looking at ways that we can come together and make change. So I hope to see you at some of those. Thank you again for joining us today. I really appreciate it.